Theories of Personality, 11th edition, Chapter 8. Raymond Cattell, Hans Eysenck, The Five-Factor Theory, HEXACO, and the Dark Triad. Predicting behavior. Cattell's goal in his study of personality was to predict how a person will behave in response to a given stimulus situation. Cattell was not interested in changing or modifying behavior from abnormal to normal, which has been the approach of other personality theorists. Those more clinically oriented theorists based their work on case studies of patients who were unhappy or emotionally disturbed and wanted to change. In contrast, Cattell's subjects were normal people. His aim was to study their personality, not to treat it. He believed it was impossible, or at least unwise, to attempt to change personality before understanding fully what was to be modified. A scientific approach. Cattell's approach to personality was rigorously scientific, relying on observations of behavior and masses of data. In his research, it was not unusual for more than 50 kinds of measurements to be taken from a single subject. Factor analysis. The hallmark of Cattell's approach was his treatment of the data. He submitted them to the statistical power called factor analysis, which involves assessing the relationship between each possible pair of measurements taken from a group of subjects to determine common factors. For example, scores on two different psychological tests or on two subscales of the same test would be analyzed to determine their correlation. If the two measures showed a high correlation with one another, Cattell concluded that they measured similar or related aspects of personality. For example, if the anxiety and introversion scales of personality test yielded a high correlation coefficient, we could conclude that both scales were measuring the same personality characteristic. Thus, two sets of data about a person combined to form a single dimension or factor. Personality traits. Cattell referred to these factors as traits, which he defined as the mental elements of a personality. Only when we know someone's traits can we predict how that person will behave in a given situation. Thus, to be able to understand someone fully, we must be able to describe in precise terms the entire pound of traits that define a person as an individual. The life of Cattell, 1905 to 1998. An older brother and wounded soldiers. Cattell was born in Stansfordshire, England. I can't pronounce the name, I'm sorry. His parents had high, exacting standards of behavior for their children, but were also permissive about how the children spent their time. Cattell's brothers and friends spent much time outdoors, sailing and swimming, exploring caves and fighting mock battles. Cattell's life changed dramatically at the age of 9 when England entered World War I. A nearby mansion was converted to a hospital, and he saw trainloads of wounded soldiers returning from the battlefields of France. He wrote that this experience made him unusually serious for a young boy and aware of the brevity of life and need to accomplish well one might. Psychology, a bad choice. At age 16, Cattell enrolled at the University of London to study physics and chemistry, graduating with honors in 3 years. Nice. His time in London intensified his interest in social problems, and he came to realize that the physical sciences did not equip him to deal with social ills. He decided that the best solution was to study the human mind. That was a courageous decision to make in 1924 because the field of psychology in England offered few professional opportunities and only 6 academic professionalships in the entire country. It was regarded as a discipline for eccentrics. Against the advice of friends, Cattell began graduate studies at the University of London, working with the eminent statistician Charles E. Spearman, who had developed this technique of factor analysis. With his PhD in 1929, Cattell found that his friends were right. There were very few jobs for psychologists. He did some lecturing at Exeter University, wrote a book about the English countryside, and set up a psychological clinic for the schools in the city of Lancaster, all pursuing his own research interests. A time of hardship. During this period, Cattell developed chronic digestive disorders from overwork, a deficient diet, and being forced to live in a cold basement apartment. His wife left him due to his poor economic prospects and total absorption in his work. However, Cattell did claim some positive benefits from that time of hardship. The experience forced him to focus on practical problems rather than theoretical experimental issues, which he might have done given the more secure and comfortable circumstances. Success in America. 8 years after he earned his doctoral degree, Cattell finally received an opportunity to work full time in his chosen field. The prominent American psychologist Edward L. Thorndike invited Cattell to spend a year at Thorndike's laboratory at Columbia University in New York. The following year, Cattell accepted a professorship at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and in 1941, moved to Harvard. His colleagues included Gordon Allport and William Sheldon, who was then developing his theory of personality and body type. Cattell married a mathematician who shared his research interests, and at the age of 40 settled at the University of Illinois as a research professor. He published more than 500 articles as well as 43 books, a monumental accomplishment that reflected his dedication and perseverance. In his 70s, Cattell joined the graduate facility of the University of Hawaii, where he permitted himself the luxury of swimming in the ocean every day. It is said that he worked as hard as an assistant professor up for tenure and not sure that it will be granted. He died in Honolulu at the age of 92, 1 year after he had been awarded the Gold Medal World for Life Achievement in Psychological Science from the American Psychological Association. Cattell's approach to personality traits. Cattell defined traits as the relatively permanent reaction tendencies that are basic structural units of the personality. He classified traits in several ways. Some common traits and unique traits. Cattell distinguished between common traits and unique traits. A common trait is one that is possessed by everyone to some degree. Intelligence, extroversion, and gregariousness are examples of common traits. Everyone has these traits, but some people have them to a greater extent than others. Cattell's reason for suggesting that common traits are universal is that all people have a similar hierarchy, hereditary potential and are subject to similar social pressures, at least within the same culture. People differ, as we said, in that they possess different amounts of or degrees of these common traits. They also differ because of the unique traits, those aspects of personality shared by few other people. Unique traits are particularly apparent in our interests and attitudes. For example, one person may have a consuming interest in genealogy, whereas another may be passionate in Civil War battles, or etc., other things. Ability, temperament, and dynamic traits. The second way to classify traits is to divide them into ability traits, temperament traits, and dynamic traits. Ability traits determine how efficiently we will be able to work toward a goal. Intelligence is an ability trait. Our level of intelligence will affect the ways in which we strive for our goals. Temperament traits describe the general style and emotional tone of our behavior. For example, how assertive, easygoing, or irritable we are. These traits affect the ways we act and react to situations. Dynamic traits are the driving forces of behavior. They define our motivations, interests, and ambitions. Surface traits and source traits. A third class of traits is surface traits versus source traits, according to the stability and performance. Surface traits are personality characteristics that correlate with one another but do not constitute a factor because they are not determined by a single source. For example, several behavioral elements such as anxiety, indecision, and irrational fear combine to form the surface trait labeled neuroticism. Of greater importance are source traits, which are unitary personality factors that are much more stable and permanent. Each source trait gives rise to some aspect of behavior. Source traits are those individual factors derived from factor analysis that combine to account for surface traits. Constitutional traits and environmental mold traits. Source traits are classified by their origin as either constitutional traits or environmental mold traits. Constitutional traits originate as biological conditions but are not necessarily innate. Environmental mold traits derive from our influences in our social and physical environments. These traits are learned characteristics and behaviors that impose a pattern on the personality. The behavior of a person reared in an impoverished inner city neighborhood is molded differently than one raised in upper class luxury, etc., others like that. Source traits, the basic factors of personality. After more than 2 decades of intense factor analytic research, Cattell identified 16 source traits as the basic factors of personality. These are best known in the form in which they are most often used as the 16 personality factor questionnaire. Cattell later identified additional factors he designated as temperamental traits because they relate to the general style and emotional tone of behavior. He gave us examples such as excitability, zest, self discipline, politeness, and self assurance. Dynamic traits, the motivating forces. Cattell described dynamic traits as the traits concerned with motivation, which is an important issue in many personality theories. Cattell believed that a personality theory that failed to consider the impact of dynamic or motivating forces is incomplete. The influences of hereditary and environment. Cattell showed great interest in the relative influences of hereditary and environment in shaping personality. He investigated the importance of hereditary and environmental factors by statistically comparing similarities found between twins reared in the same family, twins apart, not twin related siblings in the same family, and non twin siblings reared apart. The results of his analysis showed that for some traits, hereditary plays a major role. Stages of personality development. Cattell proposed 6 stages in the development of personality covering the entire lifespan. Infancy. The period of infancy, from birth to age 6, is a major formative period for personality. The child is influenced by parents and siblings and by the experiences of weaning and toilet training. Social attitudes develop along with ego and superego, feelings of security or insecurity, attitudes towards authority, and a possible tendency to neuroticism. Cattell was not a follower of Freud's, but he incorporated several Freudian ideas into his theory. Childhood. Between ages 6 and 14. The childhood stage of personality formation, there are a few psychological problems. This stage marks the beginning of a move towards independence from parents and an increasing identification with peers. Adolescence. 14 to 23. Emotional disorders and delinquency may be evident as young people experience conflicts centered around independence, self-assertion, and pleasure. Maturity. The fourth phase of development. Maturity lasts from 23 to 50, a productive, satisfying time in terms of career, marriage, and family situations. Personality becomes less flexible compared with earlier stages, and thus emotional stability increases. Late maturity, 50 to 65, involves personality development in response to physical, social, and psychological changes. Some things may decline, and people re-examine their views and search for a new self. Old age, 65 to death, involves adjustments to different kinds of losses, death of others, death of career, relatives, friends, spouses, loss of status, and loneliness. Questions about human nature. Cattell's definition of personality gives us clues about his view of human nature. He wrote, personality is that which permits a prediction of what a person will do in a given situation. For behavior to be considered predictable, it must be lawful and orderly. Prediction would be difficult without regularity and consistency in the personality. For example, one spouse can usually predict with considerable accuracy what the other spouse will do in a given situation because of the history. Cattell did not propose any ultimate or necessary goal that dominates behavior, no drive for self-accusation, no psychosexual conflicts. Although he did note the impact of early life events, he did not believe that childhood forces determine the personality permanently. Cattell accepted the influence on personality of both nature and nurture. Cattell took a moderate position, noting the existence of common traits which apply to everyone in a culture and unique traits which describe the individual. Cattell's personal view of human nature is clear. In his younger years, he was optimistic, and reality did not live up to his expectations. However, he came to believe that human nature in society had regressed. Assessment in Cattell's theory. Life records. L data. The L data technique involves observers' ratings of specific behaviors exhibited by people in real life settings, such as classroom or office. The important point is that L data is they involve overt behaviors that can be seen by an observer and occur naturalistically. Questionnaires. The Q data technique relies on questionnaires. Whereas the L data technique calls for observers to rate the subjects, the Q data techniques require them to rate themselves. Cattell recognized the limitations of this data. First, some people may only have superficial awareness, and their answers may not actually reflect truthfully. Second, they may lie. Personality tests, also known as T-data. The T-data technique involves the use of what Cattell called objective tests, in which a person responds without knowing what aspect of behavior is being evaluated. These tests circumvent the Q-data shortcomings by making it difficult for a subject to know precisely what a test is measuring. If you cannot guess what the experimenter is trying to find out, you cannot distort your responses. Cattell considered tests such as the Rorschach, the thematic appreciation test, and the word association test to be objective. However, the use of the word objective is misleading. Such tests are usually subjective because of the biases. The 16PF, or personality factor test, he developed several tests to assess personality. The most notable is the 16PF test, which is based on the 16 major source traits. The test is intended for use with people 16 years of age and older and yields scores on each of the 16 scales. He developed several variations of this test, scales that have been prepared to measure specific aspects of personality, and there's also variations of the test for children and adolescents. Researching Cattell's theory. In discussing research methods, he listed 3 ways to study personality: derivative, clinical, and multivariative approaches. The derivative approach, or two-variable approach, is the standard laboratory experimental method. The psychologist manipulates the independent variable to determine the effect on the subject's behavior. This approach has also been called univariate because only one variable is studied at a time. He agreed that this research is as scientific, rigorous, and quantitative, but argued that it dealt with only limited aspects of personality. In reality, personality is affected by many interacting variables. Also, in the typical artificial laboratory situation, significant emotional experiences cannot be manipulated and duplicated. Give me one moment. Okay, I'm trying to access a YouTube video to listen to while doing this, and it hates me. Of course, it hates me. I'll just have to work with that right now. One moment. Go on. Sorry, I like listening to videos while I do this. What was that? The clinical approach. The clinical approach, which includes case studies, dreams, and dream analysis for association and other similar techniques, is highly subjective. The multivariative approach. Cattell chose to study personality through the multivariative approach, which yields highly specific data and involves the sophisticated statistical procedure of factor analysis. Cattell favored 2 forms of this, the R technique and P technique. R technique involves collecting large amounts of data from a group of people. The P technique involves collecting large amounts of data from a single subject over a long period of time. A sample of research findings. Let us consider a few of the hundreds of factor analysis studies Cattell and his associates conducted, as well as more recent examples of research using Cattell's test. We noted that he was interested in the relative effects of personality on hereditary and environment. From factor analysis of 16PF test data from he concluded, I'm going to skip some stuff here because I don't really care about this because it's just saying how stuff can be faked and how some of this testing actually went. Reflections on Cattell's theory. Despite Cattell's legitimate claim that factor analysis is an objective, precise technique, critics argue that the opportunity exists for subjectivity to affect the outcome. At several stages in the research process, decisions are required that may be influenced by personal preferences. In the initial step of data collection, researchers must decide which tests to use and what aspects of behavior to measure. They must then determine which factor analytical approach, typically technique, to apply and what level of statistical significance will be accepted as appropriate. Once the factors or traits have been identified, the researcher labels them. Cattell understood his failure to persuade other psychologists of the wisdom of his views and defended his approach as the only one of value for studying personality. At the age of 85, he reiterated the point, criticizing contemporary psychologists for failing to master and apply factor analysis and lamenting that his work remained isolated. The consensus of current opinion among personality psychologists affirms his belief in the value of his approach. Behavioral genetics. We've mentioned the growing evidence to support the idea that some traits are influenced by hereditary factors. The area of study focusing on the connection between genetics and personality is often called behavioral genetics. Regardless of the method used to evaluate or investigate personality, a significant genetic component must be considered. Albert and Cattell were among the first to suggest that inherited factors shape personality and that the rank in importance with environmental factors. Now we're going to talk about other researchers who persuaded this connection. Hans Eysenck, 1916 to 1987, resigned in true psychology. He was born in Berlin and immigrated to England in 1934 after Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany. He wanted to study physics at the University of London, but he was told he lacked the academic background. And he was told that there's always psychology, so he enrolled, and well, it showed that he did good. But it was something he had to resign to, because it wasn't his actual first choice at all. A prolific record. He published 79 books and 1,097 journal articles. Nice. Developed several personality assessment devices. Blah blah blah. The dimensions of personality. Eysenck spent most of his career at the University of London's Modelsey Hospital Institute of Psychiatry, conducting research on the measurement of personality. He was also a critic of factor analysis and of Cattell's research. A joint effort, he and his second wife together developed many of the questionnaires used in their research, the Eysenck Personality Inventory, 12 years of joint research, and 20 factor analysis. 3 dimensions of personality. The result of their efforts is a personality theory based on 3 dimensions. The E, extroversion versus introversion, neuroticism versus emotional stability, and psychotism versus impulse control. He noted that the dimensions of extroversion and neuroticism have been recognized as basic elements of personality since the time of ancient Greek philosophers. Blah, 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 blah. Stability over time. Things remain stable for most of the people's lives. Intelligence can have some variation in things. Extroversion, we know what extroverts are. Neuroticism, anxious. Okay, I'm just gonna read the little sheet. Sociable, anxious, aggressive. Oh, I'm just gonna skip this. I'm sorry. Psychotism. Okay, 2. Eysenck traits and dimensions are determined primarily by hereditary. Robert McCrae and Paul Cozzotto, the 5-factor model. They were just measuring the 5 factors: neuroticism, worried, insecure, nervous, high-strung; extroversion, sociable, talkative, fun, affectionate; openness, original, independent, creative; agreeableness, good-natured, soft-hearted, trusting; conscientiousness, careful, reliable, hardworking. I'm kind of skipping this stuff because I'm not too sure how information. Although it's just the variety of research and studies. Michael Ashton and Kevin Lee, the 6-factor model, hostility, humility, emotionality, extroversion, agreeableness, consciousness, openness, disagreements. There's just a lot of different models. Okay, so that was chapter 8 of personality theory. Thank you for joining me for that lovely journey.